Good afternoon and welcome back to today's Provincial Virtual Learning Exchange. This is the second webinar in today's event, and this webinar is going to be on the topic of navigating the settlement needs of refugee claimants. My name is Sabrina Dimitra and I'm AMSA Settlement Coordinator, and I will be assisting with today's event. We gratefully acknowledge the financial support of the Province of British Columbia through the Ministry of Jobs, Trade and Technology for this training webinar. So I would like to introduce our first speaker of the day. Our first speaker is Aaron C. Roth with Edelman & Co. Law Offices. Aaron practices immigration, citizenship, and refugee law at Edelman & Co. in Vancouver. She completed a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of Alberta, followed by completing law school at the University of Toronto. She was called to the bar in Ontario in 2009 and in British Columbia in 2016. Aaron appears regularly before the federal courts, at citizenship hearings, and before the Immigration and Refugee Board. Aaron started her practice with an emphasis on refugee law, focusing on claims before the Refugee Protection Division and the judicial review of refugee refusals. Her practice has since expanded to inadmissibility cases and appeals, as well as federal court applications for all types of refusals or delayed applications. Working with refugees, however, remains an important component of her practice. I'd like to hand it over to Erin now.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here. So I think I'm being asked to do a Refugees 101 in 30 minutes. If I speak too quickly or don't say enough details, please forgive me. I could talk all day on this topic. So I wanted to start with what is a refugee and looking at the legal definitions. So in Canada, we have two categories of refugee. One we would consider a convention refugee, and that follows under the United Nations Conventions regarding the status of refugees. And this requires that the individual be outside of their country of origin and face persecution for one of the enumerated grounds, which is based on a personalized and often immutable characteristic of that person. These are race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, which often would include, in refugee claims in Canada, gender or being part of the LGBTQ community, or political opinion. And this also would include somebody whose political opinion is imputed to them. It might not be what they actually believe, but what those around them perceive as their beliefs. The second category in Canada is what we would loosely refer to as a protected person, which is somebody who faces a risk to their life or a risk of cruel and unusual treatment or punishment. And this has to be a very personalized risk. It can't be a risk that everyone in their country would face. One of the main examples of this we often see as victims of crime. And this does not count as a personalized risk if simply there are high levels of crime in that country. But if the individual was repeatedly targeted because of some personalized characteristic of them, this might rise to the level of a risk to life or a risk of cruel and unusual treatment. So if we just look at our terminology, when somebody is requesting refugee protection, we would call them a refugee claimant. And somebody who has been granted protection and found to be face a risk to their life or a risk of persecution, we would call them a refugee or a convention refugee if granted under the United Nations Convention definition, or protected person. But if you look at the legislation in Canada and the rights that follow, it's generally just protected person. Asylum is not frequently used in Canada, but it is essentially what is granted to that person. Canada would offer asylum when it does grant protection. So refugee claims can be made inside of Canada or outside of Canada. When outside of Canada, they're made through a Canadian visa office, consulate or embassy, and in Canada through various means I'm going to come back to in a moment. So following from the definition, the person must still be outside of their country. So if we're looking at an Afghan refugee, there must also be outside of Afghanistan. And in most circumstances, that claimant must also be recognized already by UNHCR. Now, this recognition by UNHCR is not universal, and it does change with legislation and political will, because there's government policies that come in and come out of depending on international circumstances and, again, political will. Now, the Overseas Refugee Program, from a Canadian perspective, is primarily about the resettlement of refugees into Canada. And these refugees, when they come to Canada, actually enter Canada as permanent residents, and they benefit from a one-year package of resettlement services. And what those services are depends upon what type of resettlement that was afforded to them. So one form is the government-sponsored refugee, where the government of Canada actually selects and then assists these refugees through their resettlement in Canada. The second category is sponsorship agreement holders, and these are organizations within Canada that have been pre-approved by the Government of Canada to help support and resettle refugees in Canada. And the last group we would call a group of 5, or local community organizations. And these are small groups from across the country that apply to the Government of Canada for permission and approval to help resettle refugees into Canada. For most, and I guess the goal of this presentation is primarily about refugee claims being made within Canada. And they really can be initiated in 3 different ways. The first method is that when somebody arrives in Canada at a port of entry, whether it's by land or at an airport, they can simply make a refugee claim, request protection right then and there at the border when they enter Canada. The second method are for people that are already inside of Canada, and they would make a claim by going to an immigration or an IRCC office. The third location of initiating a claim happens when a person has been detained or in some way come to the notice of the Canada Border Services Agency, the CBSA. For example, if they're in Canada without status, or if they've in some way contravened some provision in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. For example, maybe CBSA believes they've worked without authorization, or they've somehow simply come to the attention of the authorities. And in this circumstance, the person during that interview process can also make a refugee claim. But it's very important for them to make their refugee claim, or to say, I want to be a refugee, before the CBSA issues them any sort of removal order because of their contravention of the Act. For example, because of being in Canada without status, because of working without authorization. Now, every single person who does initiate a refugee claim is given a conditional removal order. And so this is a removal order requiring them to leave Canada, but it's conditional on the refugee claim they've made. So if their refugee claim is accepted, then the removal order is cancelled. And it's only if the refugee claim is not accepted that the removal order would come into force. Now in Canada, the refugee claims are decided by the Refugee Protection Division, which is a division of the Immigration and Refugee Board. And this is an independent administrative tribunal that here in Vancouver is located at the 16th floor of 300 West Georgia Street downtown. And while this tribunal falls under the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, it is not a part of the department. It is not part of IRCC and is fully independent from that. Now, we mentioned making a refugee claim at the port of entry, and there is definitely a limitation to this, and this comes under what we call the Safe Third Country Agreement. And this is an agreement between Canada and the United States addressing the processing of refugee claims. The idea is that a refugee is expected to make their claim in the first country they enter. So if somebody enters the United States, they're supposed to make their refugee claim in the United States, and similarly in Canada. And this is supposed to stop asylum shopping, where somebody simply looks for the best opportunity to make their claim. Now, this applies only at the land border crossing. It does not apply at the airport, for example. But if somebody was to show up at the land border crossing to make a refugee claim, they could be turned away from Canada and required to go back to the United States unless they had family members in Canada, or for example, they were an unaccompanied minor. And what's important about this is that once the person's been turned away, even if they later make it into Canada, they would not be eligible to make a refugee claim. So it really is a barrier to any future claim. Now, in terms of whether an overseas or an in-Canada claim is a preferred or better method, there's a lot of pros and cons with each approach. So for example, if you make your claim overseas, you arrive in Canada as a permanent resident with your spouse and children already all together. And you are given 1 year of support within the community, whether that be language training, finding doctors, finding housing, getting your children into the school system. This is all provided for you with full support. On the other hand, because your claims are processed overseas, you live for a long period of time in precarious circumstances, possibly at refugee camps or in other very uncertain circumstances. Now, when you make a claim in Canada, we were meant to have very quick processing of that refugee claim, and the benefit being that, even if the claim takes a long time to process, you're in Canada for that. Possibly you're already starting your life here and being settled. But on the other hand, if you've come to Canada without your spouse or your children, we have lengthy processing to get to your refugee hearing, and at this point, possibly up to 2 years waiting for permanent residence to be approved, and that's separation from your spouse and children through that entire period of time. So it really, I would say, depends on whether they can arrive with their spouse and children or not as to which option might be better for people. So if we come back to the methods of making a refugee claim in Canada, there are some procedural differences. All refugee claims have a basic set of IRCC application forms. So we have the generic application, which we'd loosely call the IMM 008, and the Schedule A form. And the Schedule A is where people list out their personal histories, their education, their address histories, and a lot of personal background details. And there's additionally what we would call a Schedule 12, which is basic information on identity documents en route to Canada. And these are the IRCC application forms. If you make your claim at the port of entry, all of these forms are traditionally done at that location. And there's an additional form called the basis of claim form, which most people would just call the BOC. And this is the actual heart of the refugee claim. It's within the BOC that you put forward why you're coming to Canada, what's happened to the person in their country, and these considerations. And if you've made your claim at the port of entry, you submit this BOC directly to the Refugee Board within 15 days afterwards. Now, if you're already in Canada, you actually complete all of these application forms before you go to an immigration office to initiate your claim. Formally, if you were detained by the CBSA and initiated your claim with them, you would do your forms with the CBSA. But at this point, just due to the vast number of refugees entering Canada and making claims inland with CBSA, they've recently started to actually refer these initiating claims back to the IRCC, which is really where they ought to have been initiated. So after the forms have been provided to IRCC or to the CBSA, it's expected that the information will be reviewed within 3 days, and the claim is to be referred to the Refugee Protection Division if it has been found eligible, again within those 3 days. Now, by law, the hearing is then supposed to have been scheduled within 60 days of that referral. In practice, I was noticing with my clients about a 6 to 12 month wait, but I understand that refugee claimants are now being told to expect closer to 15 to 18 months to get to their refugee hearings. I certainly hope that's more of a national number than Western region, but I think what we can expect is increasingly long wait times and possibly coming into a backlogged system that we saw, in 2012 and prior to that. Now, one category of refugee claimant or what we call DCOs, are individuals from designated countries of origin. Now, these designated countries are selected by the minister. So they're countries generally where there's a high number of refugee claims that have been refused, abandoned, or withdrawn, or where the minister believes that the country has an independent judiciary, basic democratic rights and freedoms, and a civil society. And if the minister is of the opinion that these things exist, he can add that country to a list and they become a designated country of origin. And claimants from these countries do have different legal rights. So Canada has designated most of what we may be considered developed countries, including the countries in Europe, the United States, Australia, and Japan, for example, as DCO countries. But the list does also include various Eastern European countries, such as Hungary and Romania, which do produce a good number of refugees, as well as Mexico. Now, for people from DCO countries, the refugee claim is actually supposed to happen even faster, but they are also part of the backlog, and at this point, there's no real technical difference. Now, particularly because we're considering wait times of up to a year to get to your hearing, the ability to work and start establishing a life is very important. If the refugee claimant is from a non-DCO country, as soon as their refugee claim is initiated and they have their refugee status document, they would also be required to do their immigration medical exam. They can then immediately go online and make an application for a work permit. However, if the person is from a designated country of origin, they have to wait 180 days following the claim referral in order to apply for a work permit. Now, if the person has been found to be a refugee or protected person, they are also entitled to a work permit and in fact must maintain a work permit until such time as they become a permanent resident of Canada. Now, the only real benefit with increasingly long processing times is that refugees actually have the ability to effectively prepare their case by gathering evidence and seek certain settlement and other supports within the community before they're expected to testify at their hearings. Now, in British Columbia and nationally, nearly all refugees do acquire counsel for assistance at their refugee hearings. There's very few people that attend without counsel. In British Columbia, the Legal Services Society, LSS, supports the majority of refugees. Now, in addition to directly planning for their refugee hearing, and I'm certain many of the speakers that follow me may also be commenting on the need for refugees to be supported through housing, language training, trauma counseling, and other services. And these are all very useful for just stabilizing their life and putting them in the right state of mind to actually have their hearing and give testimony, which really is a lot about state of mind. For the hearing itself, once the application forms have been completed and submitted, the task turns to obtaining objective evidence to corroborate the refugee claims, as well as research to establish the objective risk. So for example, if somebody is claiming a risk based on a particular type of honor killing in a particular region of the world, research would be done to suggest that that risk is not just in the mind of the refugee claimant, but generally known, supported through Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, or various other organizations that report on country conditions around the world. Prior to the hearing, it's really important for the refugee claimant to practice, to make sure that they feel comfortable talking about their circumstances and can express themselves and understand also what the legal test is so that they understand what they're trying to establish for the refugee board. One thing that I find very important, and I know what we talked about later, is that going to the ready tours and seeing the room and really experiencing what they're going to be facing on the day of their hearing can relieve a lot of stress. So you were saying before the basis of claim form is sort of the heart of the refugee claim. And so this, together with the Schedule A, really has to be carefully considered. One of the really frustrating circumstances is where somebody only puts down a small amount of what happens to them. And when they get to the refugee hearing, the board member says, well, why didn't you include this in your basis of claim form? Why is this different? And the board member might even say, well, now today at the hearing, you're embellishing yourself. You're trying to add to your claim to make it sound worse than it was. Because credibility is ultimately one of the most important characteristics. So the basis of claim really has to be carefully prepared. And it has to be prepared in conjunction with the other forms. So first, if the individual is saying, I was really scared and I had to go into hiding and I lived in this location and then they found me there and I went to another location, it's really important that the Schedule A form, where you list an address history, for example. Okay. So anyway, where we list the address history or the employment history in the Schedule A form matches where the person said they were living or residing while they were in hiding. And this level of making sure everything's consistent, again, goes to the credibility of the claimant and can become vital at the refugee. And so when you go through what needs to be considered and what the refugee should be thinking about is what the legal test is. You need to be able to establish your identity. If it's purely that you're from one country, well, that's your documents. But maybe you're from a subset or a tribe within your country. So making sure they discuss that and possibly have documentation for it. When we say nexus, that means, do you fit within one of the United Nations Convention definitions of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group? And making sure that's also addressed and identified for the board member. Now, subjective fear is a really big category, and it's often combined with credibility for board members. And this asks the question, did the person act as one might expect somebody in their circumstances to act? It's highly subjective and it's assessed in many different ways. But the main questions that are asked to try to objectify this subjective analysis is, did the person delay in leaving the country? Did the person fail to make a refugee claim somewhere else along route? For example, if in coming to Canada they stopped over in England for 2 weeks, well, why didn't they make a refugee claim in England? Did the person leave their country and then return to it for some reason at some point in time since their troubles started? And similarly, did they delay in making a refugee claim after arrival in Canada? Now, a person can have done many of these things and still be a genuine refugee, but it's important to think about these and maybe have an explanation already prepared in the basis of claim form for why they took the steps they did. Now, when we look at objective risk, we're looking at, similarly situated people. Are other people in that country experiencing the same things as they are? And is this documented somewhere else, for example, in human rights reports and other newspaper articles? And even within the refugee claimant themselves, they could talk about what happened to their brother or their cousin or a coworker at their job as a way to demonstrate that this is part of a pattern of activities because of their identity or some other characteristic. Now, we also make the assumption that a person should seek state protection in their own country before coming to Canada. So it's important to set out first what steps the person did take to seek protection, what happened, and if the person did not do anything to seek protection in their country, then why not? There could be a very good explanation. For example, if we're talking about someone claiming on the basis of their sexual orientation, going to the police in many countries to complain about being threatened or assaulted simply might make your problems much worse. And finally, what we call internal flight alternative. And it's the expectation that before leaving your country to seek international protection, you should ask, is there somewhere else in my country where I could have lived safely? If you fear a particular group of people, could those people still find you or access you, 1,000 kilometers away, depending on how big the country is? And these are all things to contemplate in the basis of claim form and to address there if possible. The claim form is set up with a series of questions. Who is it that you fear? What do you fear would happen to you? Did you seek state protection? But a lot of the times I do find it's actually easier to simply do a chronological story or a narrative of what's happened to them and the choices they've made. Okay. So on the day of the refugee hearing, the board seeks to make 75% oral decisions. So the vast majority of refugee claimants are expected to know their decision. that same day. If you're approved, refugees are able to make their claim for permanent residence, and they can include their spouse and children. And in terms of the children that can be included, this is any dependent child under the age of 22. And under the age of 22 is actually locked in at the date of making the refugee claim. So even now that we're delaying how long refugee claims are taking to process, your children are still locked in at the date of the claim. Now, if refused, then the claimant can make an appeal to the Refugee Appeal Division, which is another division within the Immigration and Refugee Board. Now, I think I'm starting to run out of time, so I'm going to leave the numbers for people to peruse on their own. A quick thing that I can say is that the Western region has a very wide dispersal of types of countries. So for example, as Turkey has 11% of the claims, 33% of the Western region claims are countries that have 1% or less of our pool of refugees. Now, if a refugee claimant has been refused protection, there are a couple different options still available for them depending on their circumstances. So we have a humanitarian and compassionate application, but there is a 12-month bar to make this application from the date of the Refugee Protection Division or Refugee Appeal Division decision. Now, this application doesn't look at risk to life or persecution, but whether or not the person would experience hardship if having to return to their country, and essentially their establishment or connections to Canada. Now, the 12-month bar does not apply if there are children involved in the refugee claim or children directly affected by the refugee claimants themselves, and where the refugee claim was based upon a lack of access to health or medical care. There is also a pre-removal risk assessment that is a last opportunity processed by IRCC to assess risk prior to removal. But a person or a refugee claimant only has access to the PRAW if 12 months have passed since the final refugee decision, either again by the Refugee Protection Division or the Refugee Appeal Division. And it's actually a 36-month bar in the case of DCO claimants. Now, in conclusion, one of the biggest concerns that we see are people who were found to be refugees, became permanent residents of Canada, and then, for one reason or another, returned to their countries. This could be for, to see a wedding, or because a family member is ill or has passed away, or for various other reasons. But the problem is that a person can lose their refugee status, and including their permanent resident status in Canada, if they do return to their country of origin, or even use the passport from their country of origin. The passport is considered the property of that country. So even if you're traveling to, for example, the United States on that passport, you have put yourself back under the jurisdiction of your home country. If there was any sort of government intervention in the United States, they would call your own embassy, essentially. And so using your own passport to travel is considered reavailment in that sense. Although generally, immigration and the CPSA will typically only come after the person if they have actually returned to their country of origin. And the idea is if you can go back to that country, if you can trust them, then you're no longer a person in need of protection. You no longer fit that definition of being a refugee. And they can then apply to the Refugee Protection Division to have your refugee protection ceased or stopped. If you're already a permanent resident, this does lead to loss of permanent residence and removal from Canada. So this is a really serious matter to be aware of in the after the claim has been accepted period. So that hopefully is Refugees 101, and there will be questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. So please, if you do have any questions for Erin, we will be having a combined Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but please submit your questions either using the question box or to events@amsa.org throughout the presentation. I would now like to welcome our next webinar presenter, Bonnie Wong from the Settlement Orientation Services. Bonnie Wong is a refugee claimant settlement worker working at Settlement Orientation Services SOS since 2012. She provides settlement services to refugee claimants during their claim process. Bonnie is multilingual and assists clients in Mandarin, Cantonese, and English. So I'd like to welcome Bonnie.
Yeah, my name is Bonnie Wong, and I work as a settlement worker at the Settlement Orientation Services. We have a short form for this, is SOS, so I will refer my organization as SOS throughout this presentation. Sabrina asked SOS to have a presentation on the services that we provide to our clients. SOS is under ISS of BC. SOS provides settlement services specifically to refugee claimants in various languages. We have 6 settlement workers who speaks in Arabic, who can speak in Arabic, Mandarin, Cantonese, Farsi, Dari, French, Kurdish, and Spanish. And we also have 2 health promotion and case management staff. SOS hosts weekly drop-in groups on refugee claimant health and settlement orientation. It's every Saturday from 10 to 4 p.m. and it's a drop-in group at the SOS office. SOS is conveniently located at the ISS of BC Welcome Center. This location is very close, within few minutes walk to the Commercial and Broadway SkyTrain station. So SOS works closely with all those organizations that I just mentioned through referrals, and our clients get services from those mentioned organizations. And if you look at this chart here, it has listed out the last few years since 2013, the number of new refugee claimants served by SOS. So in 2013, the number is 378. 2014 and 2015, some increase, but not dramatic. But then there's a big jump in the new number of refugee claimants served by SOS. In the year 2016, we see 725. And then there's another huge jump in 2017. The total number of new clients that coming to SOS is 1,277. So if you compare the year 2013 and 2017, SOS has served the comparison, like in 2017, the new clients that SOS has, it's more than triple the year 2013. We have only had 4 settlement workers and 2 health staff until very recently that we add 2 more staff. So you can see that our staff have working under a lot of heavy load with the same staff, but a big jump in number of clients served. The trends and observations of the new clients served by SOS. In the year 2017, the top 5 source countries with new refugee claimants coming to SOS to get services. Number 1 is Afghanistan, number 2 Iraq, and 3rd place is Mexico, 4th place Colombia, and number 5 is Iran. The top languages of those new refugee claimants, the number 1 language mostly spoken by our new clients is Spanish, followed by Arabic and also Farsi. Among the new refugee claimants in 2017 served by SOS, over 90% of them walked across the Canada-US border. If they cross the border in BC, it's mostly, or you could say over 99% is crossed the Peace Arch US-Canada border. So now I'm going to talk about services, settlement services that SOS provides during the entire refugee claim process. I will have my talk divided into 3 phases. First one is pre-claim assistance. Second one is claim process settlement services. And then the third one will be post-claim services. The first one is services prior to the refugee claim process. At SOS, when we have a new client first time coming into our office, we will first provide orientation and guidance about the refugee claim process to the client. And also we will provide assistance with filling out government forms, like what Aaron mentioned, that the Schedule A, Schedule 12, generic forms. If the client has not started any paperwork in regards to the refugee claim process. And we will help the clients to navigate the refugee claim process, immigration and work permit process as well. Give them a brief explanation of those processes. And we will do referrals to meet the new client's immediate needs. So in terms of giving orientation services to the new claimants, SOS runs an orientation group on a weekly basis. For refugee claimants, it's on every Saturday from 10 to 4 p.m. It's a drop-in group, so every new claimant is welcome to come and join the group every Saturday, and that's in addition to one-on-one orientation service provided by our settlement workers. At this orientation group workshop, we provide interpretation services. Also, there'll be some snacks, and clients can get bus tickets if they need. If their financial situation is not as good, then we'll provide them bus tickets to come and also to go home as well from the workshop. At the workshop, we'll talk about valuable information about navigating the refugee claim process and also the healthcare system regarding health and settlement services. SOS, in terms of helping out clients with paperwork, we settlement workers assist the new clients with various government forms. Depends on what stage the client is at. For instance, say that if the client comes into our office advising us that the client has never started any paperwork, then we would assist them with filling out the forms to make the refugee claim. Forms including Schedule A, Schedule 12, generic form. And SOS does not touch the basis of claim form, the BOC. Because like Aaron mentioned, that this is a very important piece of document. So SOS thinks that this form should be filled out by the client's lawyer or legal counsel. I tried to attach the different forms, but unable to attach all of them. So the only one form that we could attach here in the slide is the Schedule 12. But you should be able to find all the forms if on the in the IRCC website. When a new client start to come into SOS office, we will also refer the client to different services. Again, that depends on the stage of the refugee claimants in terms of their refugee process. For instance, if the client hasn't started any of the refugee claimant process, then we would refer them to legal aid. In the case that if legal aid has rejected the client's application, then we would refer pro bono to the client. Pro bono, unfortunately, has very limited resources. It would only be able to arrange half an hour free legal consultation to each client. And also we could refer the client to the UBC Law Student Legal Advice Program. But this UBC Law Student Program should not have any time sensitive case. How it happens is that the UBC Law student usually will meet the client the first time for about an hour and get the main idea about the client's case. And then the student will go back to talk to the supervisor, who is usually practicing immigration lawyer. Talk to the supervisor and then decide whether their program will be able to help the client or not, like further help the client or not. So if any urgent matter or urgent case, then this may not be a good option for the client. And SOS would also help the client to meet its accommodation needs for usually newly arrived refugee claimants. We would refer the clients to inland refugee societies or to Kimbrace for families situation or journey homes. Or we could also refer BC 2119 to the clients for available shelters such as Balkan House or Covenant's House. And if a client is in need of food and clothing for urgent need, we could also refer the client to Salvation Army for the clothing bank and for food bank registration. And if the client also wants some furniture, and we could also through the Salvation Army the client will be referred to the Home Star program to get some furnitures. And SOS will also refer the client to a clinic, medical clinic, or a dental clinic if required. The clinics who is accepting IFH, for instance, like the clinic located inside the ISS of BC Welcome Center. That clinic is very convenient to our clients who are already getting services from SOS or VAST or Vancity. But if they also need to see a doctor, then the clinic is right there, so convenient. For clients who have children, at school-age children, then we'll refer the client to a school board for school enrollment, depends on where they live. Other services that SOS will refer to, such as mental health services like VAST, also free English classes. A lot of refugee claimants are very interested in learning English as soon as they are able. And some clients are also interested to get entrance or to get entrance to the recreation centers, and usually those recreation centers will give them a free pass for newly arrived refugees. So the second stage is services during the refugee claim process. Once our client have been issued the refugee protection claimant document, we will refer them to welfare office for income assistance application. The income assistance application will allow the refugee claimant to receive hardship allowance. There's a maximum amount per month. It is an online application, so normally the clients will have this application done by ministry worker at the welfare office. But we provide a letter for a letter of support for the client to bring to the welfare office. At the welfare office, many cases that the ministry worker will register the client for an MSP number. So the number is given to the client, but it doesn't mean that the client is eligible to apply at that point of time. I'm going to talk about when they will be eligible to apply a little bit later. So once the client is eligible for MSP and got registered already, then they will be charged to pay MSP premium monthly. And so on the right-hand side, that you see that's a template letter that usually we will write to support the client application for income assistance. The other service that during this refugee claim process we refer clients to is immigration medical exam. So this is a required medical exam. It's required by IRCC, and the clients, the refugee claimants, must get this medical exam done within 30 days after the refugee protection document. They can only go to a designated clinic or doctors approved by IRCC. We'll also refer the client to Vancity to open a bank account. For many new refugee claimants just recently arrived in Canada, they need to set up a bank account. But normally, because their passport has already been seized by either CBSA or IRCC, so the only one piece of document or ID they have is the refugee protection document, the claimant document. But normally the bank requires two pieces of ID. So SOS has an agreement with Van City that Van City will be helping out SOS clients to set up new bank account with SOS referral letter. And also Van City will be able to provide PR fee if the clients requires such a loan in later on when they're applying for PR applications. Ready Tour is very important part of the refugee claimant process that we feel that every refugee claimant should participate in this Ready Tour. So the Ready Tour is provided by IRB, but through Kimbrace. It helps the clients, the refugee claimants, to familiarize themselves with the IRB hearing process and also to physically see where the hearing takes place. So then on the actual hearing day, they will feel less. The other service that we provide during this process is to help them to fill out work permit application form. So after the refugee claimant has done the medical exam, they will be eligible to apply for work permit, and we will help them to fill out the work permit application forms and apply online. Online application currently takes about less than a month. Comparing to if it's by mail, the application, if it's sent by mail, it takes about 4 months. So we encourage all our clients to apply online. And once the client has received work permit, they will be getting a SIM number from Service Canada. The SIM number is a temporary one, starting with the number 9, but they will get a more permanent number once they become a PR. And other services we will refer clients to will be including referring the client to the ISS of BC, the Career Counseling Services. For some low-income clients, they may be eligible for a farmer care program that will help them to apply. And for seniors over 60 years old with low income, we will help them to apply for a bus pass program. So stage 3 services, post-claim services. If it's a positive IRB decision, then SOS will assist the clients to apply PR application. We will fill out the generic forms, Schedule A, Schedule 14, additional family information. So usually those are the 4 main forms for PR applications. And if required, then we'll help the client to apply to Van City for PR fee loans. Some clients also would like to apply for travel documents. So our settlement workers also help out with the travel document application. And we could also help with the BC housing application, Canada Child Benefit application as well, and free language training program upstairs at the Welcome Center through ISS of BC's LINK program. Once the client has received a protected person status, then they can receive free LINK training. And when the client has become a PR, SOS will refer the clients to other settlement agencies for further services, because at that point of time, then SOS will cease to provide services to that client when the client has become a PR. if a client has received a negative IRB decision, we would help the client, refer the client to apply for legal aid for the appeal. And if the legal aid denies this application, then we would refer the clients to pro bono, and there's a pro bono number there. So again, that pro bono could only offer half an hour free legal advice to each client. And we could also refer the client to a UBC Law Student Legal Advice Program. Like I mentioned previously, that this program, if they meet the client for the first time for 1 hour, then they would decide whether they can help this client later on after checking with the law student's supervisor. Even though the client has received a negative IRB decision, the client are still eligible to receive income assistance during the appeal process if eligible. In the ministry's standard, if they are, making low income or no income, then they're still eligible for the income assistance. And regardless whether the client has received a positive or negative IRB decision, they would need to renew their work permit before they become a PR, or as long as they still stay in Canada and their work permit expires soon. So they need to contact us and we will help them to renew their work permit application. So that concludes my presentation, and we have our information, contact information there, and feel free to give us a call or send us an email, and I will welcome your questions afterwards as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thanks for sharing your knowledge and all the work and support that SOS provides refugee claimants. And I think this is really valuable, transferable information that can be taken also to other settlement organizations and to see how they can also assist to support refugee claimants. And so we've mentioned it a couple of times now in both presentations, the Ready Tours. And so now we're going to be welcoming Fran Gallo, who is the Ready Tour coordinator, to be talking and presenting about the Ready Tours. Fran began working at Kinbrace in 2010 when she took on the position of Ready Tour coordinator. She continues in this role while directing the development of the Refugee Hearing Preparation Guide. She has been involved as a volunteer with a number of agencies that assist refugee claimants in surviving in Vancouver in 2001. So welcome, Fran, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, as Sabrina said, I work for Kinbrace Community Society. Kinbrace is a housing and support agency here in the east side of Vancouver, not far from AMSA. We have 6 apartments for refugee claimant families, and this year is our 20th anniversary year. Today I'd like to share 2 important resources for refugee claimants, the Ready Tour and the Refugee Hearing Preparation Guide. They can both be accessed at www.refugeeclaim.ca. So how did these begin? Back in 2008, the executive director of Kinbrace was looking at the stress that some of our residents were living with leading up to the refugee hearing. And he spoke to one of our board members who had previously been an Immigration and Refugee Board member as well, and at that time was the airport chaplain. And the chaplain had suggested, how about access to a hearing room so that claimants could see where they would be having their hearing, and hopefully that would help with the stress. So they approached a local refugee lawyer named Leslie Stalker, who was currently the United Nations, the UNHCR representative here in Vancouver. And she approached the IRB, and the IRB welcomed the idea, and so they took off in 2008. And it's been going on since then. They also occur in Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, Edmonton, and Winnipeg. So first, let's look at the Ready Tour here. So clicking on the Ready Tours, this is the website. Refugee claimants can access the Ready Tours here, so can service providers. So these tours happen every 2 weeks in Vancouver approximately. They normally happen on a Friday morning at 9:15 currently. Refugee claimants and service providers can attend. Lawyers are also welcome as healthcare providers and others, housing providers. There's only 2 requirements to attend a Ready Tour. One is that the person have completed their eligibility interview. That means they have gone to CBSA or IRCC and been found eligible to make a refugee claim, and also that they register. Those are the only 2 requirements. The tours are not intended as a place for people to decide whether or not they want to make a refugee claim. And it's not a place to get, let me see, do I want to make a refugee claim? And so it's not for those people. It's for people who have already made the refugee claim and started the process. Claimants can register online. The way they would do that is they would go to their city. So for everyone in BC, it would be Vancouver. Unless you were closer to Calgary, you could also do it there because Calgary is connected to the Vancouver IRB office. If you're a service provider, as those of you watching today are, you would click on the service provider button, indicate sorry, I clicked on the wrong provider. You would put your name. I'm just scrolling down the page. If you could for me, please. Could you scroll down for me? It would basically be your name, organization, and your position. And there's a button below it that you would find on your computer that it would say submit. It would scroll down at that upper section and you could submit it to me. It would come to my email address and I would register you for a tour, letting you know what the next upcoming session is. If you're a refugee claimant, you would click on the refugee claimant button. There's a few more questions, for example, what your hearing date is and if you have a lawyer. Claimants are prioritized, of course, by the date of their refugee hearing. After I can confirm, and contact information for claimants is required because I need to confirm with the clients that they're able to attend on the date so that I can make sure, so that I can hire an interpreter for them basically and confirm so that I can confirm with an interpreter. We do provide interpreters for anyone who attends the Ready Tour who requires one. I also need to keep track of how many people are in the room because the IRB has maximum numbers for people in the hearing room. I also, a few days prior to each Ready Tour, I will confirm with each participant to make sure that they can attend. So please don't send people to the Ready Tour without having them registered. If you don't have access to a computer and you want to call, my number is 604-328-3132. You can call and register a claimant or yourself, and you can also email me at ready@refugeeclaim.ca. And you can register with me online as well. Who refers people to the Ready Tour? It's generally folks at SOS, folks at VAST, the housing providers, refugee lawyers here in town, family members, other refugee claimants, Mosaic. There's a number of organizations. Sessions meet on the 2nd floor of 300 West Georgia Street, which is where the IRB has its offices here in Vancouver. There's a lounge area there. Everyone gathers. I take attendance, introduce refugee claimants to their interpreters, give each person a refugee hearing preparation guide who doesn't already have one in their language, and we'll discuss the guides in a few minutes. The sessions are normally 2 hours, depending on how many questions people have. The session's divided into a few parts. Generally, the officers and the people giving the presentation are either the registrar for the Western region of Canada of the IRB Refugee Protection Division or one of her case management officers. And the tour will, like I said, take about 2 hours. They'll generally do one section of the presentation, take questions, go on to the next section, take questions. They don't leave until everyone's questions are answered at the end of the session. The topics that are discussed are, for example, who are the participants in the hearing, what each person's role is. Particularly, claimants are interested about minister's counsel if they are participating in a hearing because that changes the dynamic. How to file evidence if you don't have a lawyer, how to work with the interpreter, how the hearing plays out, how breaks are given, the order of questioning, how decisions are delivered, the length of the hearing, what to do with children, what to do if you have witnesses or observers. And most interesting to me is what Erin brought up, the legal issues that can be addressed at the hearing. And so there is a section of the tour that's devoted to identity, credibility, internal flight alternatives, state protection, etc., so that clients can start thinking about these issues and if they can be sending away from back home evidence regarding some of these issues. Often refugee claimants don't get a lot of time with the lawyers. They don't get as much time as they would like with their lawyers, because lawyers get limited funding from the Legal Services Society, and they're quite thirsty for information about the process, and they ask a lot of questions. And so this is their opportunity to do that and to see the hearing room, meet an officer from the Immigration and Refugee Board. They're generally lovely people, and so it tends to be a positive experience. Along with seeing the hearing room, they learn how, when they get to where they're supposed to go the day of the hearing, how to check in, what to do if they have an observer, and how to check that person in. The officer doesn't give legal advice and normally won't take questions about individual cases, specifics of individual cases, though many of the questions that people ask are of general interest, often having to do with, why would minister's rep come to my hearing? Can the lawyer answer all the questions for me? Which is no. Why is my lawyer asking me questions? He's supposed to be on my side, or she's supposed to be on my side. And so understanding what that dynamic is and what their role will be if they have children or spouses, what their roles will be, the fact that they have to have childcare during the hearing if they have small children, the fact that now children who are under 12 aren't required to attend the hearings. So they learn lots of interesting information to help them prepare for the hearing. I feel it's important for refugee claimants to be on the tour. We often say it decreases stress, but I'd say actually for some people who are a little casual about it and thinking, oh, my lawyer will just do everything for me, I don't have to worry about anything, it sort of gives them a little drive to start thinking about their own cases, start gathering evidence and thinking about what they have back home that they could be sending away for, what they might have on their cell phone. They might be taking a look at their Facebook and what they have on their Facebook, knowing that CBSA may be looking at their Facebook accounts. And so different ideas for them to take with them in preparation for their hearings. The other resource I'd like to speak about is the Refugee Hearing Preparation Guide. This guide goes hand in hand with the Ready Tour. It contains a lot of the same information that the Ready Tour does, and a lot of the same information that's contained in the guide that refugee claimants are given by IRCC or CBSA at their eligibility interview. This might be a little more readable because it's got illustrations and it's not quite as dense. It's available. There's a guide for BC, a guide for Alberta, a guide for Toronto, a guide for Quebec, where the IRB has its RPD hearing rooms. And so if you have a claimant living here in BC, you would definitely want to check out the Vancouver, because that's where the office is of the IRB. You check out the Vancouver guide. You can see by scrolling down that there are the guide is available in BC in these languages: English, French, Spanish, Simplified Chinese, Arabic, Farsi, Sorani, Kurdish. It's right now being developed in Turkish as well. If you have a claimant that speaks a different language, for example, Somali, Urdu, Amharic, and Mongolian, for example, other provinces do have those languages, and so you could use those guides from those other provinces with your client, just letting them understand that the information about local agencies in the booklet wouldn't be relevant for them. So let's open up one of the guides here. Assuming we all speak English, you can download the guide online. You can print it from this website. Claimants who come to the Ready Tour will get a guide. They'll get a hard copy guide if they haven't already been given one, and they'll get it in their language. So this is the guide. Artistic credit goes to our graphic designer, Andrea Armstrong, here in Vancouver. Our first word of advice is get a lawyer, because we want every refugee claimant to have a lawyer. So probably on each Ready Tour, we have maybe one person that doesn't have a lawyer in the room. That tends to be the case. So the person who doesn't have the lawyer, the tour and the guide are going to be the most useful for. This guide is currently under review and it's going to be updated within the next week or two because there have been some changes, as Erin referred to, with the scheduling of hearings. So that would make number one here. It used to read, Canada's refugee protection system is fast-paced with tight timelines. Well, that's changed recently, right? And so that's what's changing in our new guide. We don't want people coming here thinking they're going to be finished in 60 days when that's not the case anymore. So that will be changing. That changes these pages here too, where it used to be quite specific timelines that they could follow. There's instruction here on where to find how to get in touch with legal aid. Throughout the booklet, there's questions that come out of the same Q&A that happened on the Ready Tour. For people who don't have a lawyer, there's some instruction on completing their BOC and submitting it. We hope that's generally not the case. And these are slightly different in each region of the country, strangely, just slightly. But this is all filing information. Gathering evidence gives them some ideas of what kind of evidence might be relevant to them. Claimants sometimes don't know they can use video, ED, internet evidence. There's the link there for the national documentation packages, which are really important for claimants to know about so that they can know what the board member is looking at about their country. And if they see that there's no information about the situation that they face, they can Google it and try to get information that they can submit in their cases along with their lawyers. Erin mentioned the definition. This is a nice, easy way for claimants to go through and see if they actually meet the definition of a convention refugee and what the factors are. There's also the other definition, persons in need of protection. And so what evidence do I have? They can fill on the right-hand side. What evidence do I have that I meet that criteria? Then the legal issues that I mentioned, state protection, internal flight alternative. These are really important for claimants to realize they're going to be questioned on these issues. And if they're not prepared for them, it's really difficult to understand what the board member is trying to get at when they ask a question. Why couldn't you live in this city instead of your village? Wouldn't you be safe there? And if not, why not? And so claimants really need to think about these issues when they're preparing their cases. This guide was reviewed by lawyers across the country, actually. We had at least one reviewing lawyer in each city. The reviewer here in Vancouver was Leslie Stalker, but a number of other lawyers had input as well. Claimants who need to submit evidence that's going into before the hearing. We know claimants are supposed to have their documents in 10 days before their refugee hearing. There are ways to get it in if it comes in late. They can request that it be considered by the board member. And if there's a good reason and they request it, they can usually be granted. Each city has a different hearing room. There are different configurations in the different city. In the prairies, they have a net between the two sides so that they don't look at each other's notes. So there's some additional Q&A, some information about how to request the right to have a witness there. The very end of the book here, well, there's a checklist for claimants for getting ready for their hearing to make sure they've met with your lawyer, attended a tour, given the IRB their addresses, people who are going to be attending the hearing. There's brief information about appeals, negative and positive decisions, and I'm trying to get here to the very end so that you can see there's a page, there's definitions. There's a page for government agency contact information. The IRB is very actually accessible. Claimants can call the case management officers about their files and actually a person will answer the phone, unlike some agencies. And at the very end, there's resources in the local community where refugee claimants can go to get orientation assistance, counseling, and settlement supports. And so I think my time's up, and I thank you very much for allowing me to participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran, and thank you for showing and sharing all the information and all the different resources. It looks like a very practical, useful guide for everyone to really download and to refer to when supporting refugee claimants. And so please do let us know when the new updated version is available. So I'd like to introduce our final speaker for today. Mariana Martinez Vieira is the Provincial Refugee Mental Health Coordinator with VAST. Mariana has over 25 years of experience working with survivors of political violence and torture both in Canada and in Latin America. She joined the Vancouver Association for Survivors of Torture, VAST, when she moved to Canada in 2003. For almost 15 years at VAST now, Mariana has been providing trauma counseling both individually and in groups. More recently, Mariana has assumed the role of clinical supervisor of VAST's clinical team. So welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here. And I'm very aware that I'm the last one, so I'll make my effort to keep you all awake. I promise to do it as short as possible and sweet. So I'll jump right into it. My purpose for being here today, to tell you about how trauma-informed groups can best support refugee claimants, can help them build community in the process of navigating a long, excruciating long at this point, refugee claim. And to anyone that says, no, but refugees do not want to join groups, I dare say, maybe, hopefully, after listening to me for a couple of minutes and getting to know about the work that is done out there in groups, you can change your mind, hopefully. So what I call a model for group-based mental health for refugees, how refugees can heal through participation at groups. And I'm going to focus on two groups. One run by VAST, the Getting Through It group for refugee claimants, and another one run by Mosaic. I'm here wearing two hats today as requested by AMSA, my VAST hat and my Mosaic I Belong for queer refugees hat. So moving on to jumping right into the VAST groups. The Getting Through It group, we've been running this group at VAST since 2014. It's, as I said, a trauma-informed psychosocial support group where we blend settlement information with trauma-informed content. So because at VAST, I know we are known to be the Refugee Mental Health Center, but we are very aware that the mental health work that we do happens in a context of huge settlement barriers and legal barriers that our clients face. So we need to blend the mental health, the trauma piece with the information, very concrete information that our clients need. So the group happens every Wednesday, 10 a.m. to 12 at the VAST office, which is located at the Welcome Center. It's open every week. There are new participants. It's open to all refugee claimants, no matter how early in the process. This is a group to support them throughout the whole spectrum of the process. There's no need to register unless the claimant needs an interpreter. So let us know if that's the case. It's multilingual, and there are very, very many language corners at the group. Next one. What to expect? What can you expect or refer clients to get at the group? What can claimants expect to get? Information about the whole claim process from day one, even before they technically become a refugee claimant. So in that way, it is different from the Ready Tour. This group, the Wednesday Getting Through It group that VAST offers, really blends and combines very nicely with the Kimbray's Ready Tour. Tips to prepare for the hearing. Tips to help support clients work with a lawyer. Maybe this is the first time ever that they've been in front of a lawyer. Tips and live practice to work with interpreters, because they learn that through participation at group week after week. And now trauma-informed lens. The group, the VAST group, is run by a clinical counselor, aware of the settlement challenges that the clients are navigating, and aware that clients are far too often sent to many classes, many workshops, many sessions, and if the mind is not here, if clients are not present, focused, grounded, if we do not address the physiological nature of trauma, the information doesn't land. So at group, we practice what we call coping skills for self-regulations to help clients be focused, present, able to concentrate when they go back to meet with a lawyer, able to absorb the information, the settlement information, to get to the places where they need to get. The group is also a space to share in community, and that witnessing peace, that sitting in a circle in community is a key element of healing. It helps claimants really land and settle in their bodies, in their mind, and here. And we do ongoing referrals. There is a table full of community resources. The Ready Tour Guide is there, the SOS pamphlets, a list of food banks in the community, ESL classes available to claimants. There are not very many, but there are some, and events that are relevant for them to attend. We make referrals primarily to, of course, Kimber's Ready Tour, Rainbow Refugee for LGBTQ refugees, and the I Belong group that I'll be talking about. So there's a very all-encompassing support to claimants week to week, a community for them to be collected and supported through this very challenging process. The next one. So different elements of group. Claimants share information, hear from previous claimants that are now convention refugees. So we hear about challenges, successes. We get guest speakers often, refugee lawyers, workers in other organizations. We address psychoeducation. There is a normalizing approach to this thing called mental health and trauma. So clients really get to learn about, it is pretty normal to experience that. Many people in the room experience that. These are things that we can do to tackle lack of sleep, stress, when we cannot concentrate. So we practice those skills. We have fun. It's not a class where people are sitting for the 2 hours. We shake it off. We address the physiological nature of trauma. And it can be done in group very nicely. And then, since it's run by a clinical counselor, there is an opportunity to have an ongoing assessment, screening of clients, and do appropriate referral for individual counseling advice or for other services. The next one. So how to refer to this group? Encourage claimants to show up on a Wednesday morning at VAS, at the Welcome Center. If you are unsure, I mentioned this before, any apprehension about group readiness, no, this client will not be willing to tell their stories, know that this is a trauma-informed group. Nobody will be put on the spot. Clients are not requested to share specifics of their story or the book. Occasionally, some clients want to share a piece, and as long as it's beneficial to the client and to the group, we go ahead. But it's very, very contained. You can refer by fax, if you will, but you can just tell clients to show up unless they need interpreter, as I said before. The next one. The voice of the clients is always good to bring. So I'll start from the last one. Look right, look left. There could be your friend. This is because we sit in a circle, and there's a huge ritual coming together, witnessing peace to that. And then we'll move around the room as well. Some of you guys in the room have been to the group, and you can bear to witness. We are so different, but also so similar. We are together. A sense of togetherness, belonging, community building, huge healing element in the aftermath of trauma. Hearing from people who've been through it, people in my shoes, gave me courage and hope. Yeah, information lands more effectively if we do it, week by week. If the facilitator shares information, but there's also the peer support element in place. The next one. Okay, so enough, or maybe not enough, but all I can cover with respect to the vast Getting Through It group for refugee claimants, a weekly group that happens at the VAS office in Vancouver. So feel free to refer all the claimants I know, and if you're curious about this group, and wherever you are, if you will be willing to start something like that, contact me as a VAS. My other hat, my Mosaic I Belong group hat. This is a wonderful group that supports LGBTQ plus refugees. Before I get started, I want to say this is one of the wonderful groups. I want to put this out there very openly. I Belong really blends wonderfully with Rainbow Refugee, and I will explain how. So, ahead. The I Belong program for LGBTQ plus refugees, two main components of this program. It's not all about I Belong, but I'm focused on this. Two groups. The peer support group that happens on the second Monday of the month, and the I Belong Trauma-Informed Counseling Group. And I say trauma-informed counseling group just to debunk this idea that a counseling group and a trauma counseling group is about pouring out stories, okay? And this one happens on the last Monday of each month. The next one. Again, some characteristics of these groups. They're open to all LGBTQ plus refugees and new immigrants. So, of course, claimants included and specific needs of claimants addressed. But this is why any LGBTQ plus claimant that you want to best support, refer them to both I Belong and Rainbow. If not, refer them to the VAST group, and from there we will refer them to both groups that best supports queer refugees. Trauma-informed as well, inclusive, is multilingual. At the I Belong groups, we can provide interpretation, and there are bus tickets provided as well. And what to expect from participation in this group? Community building is a big piece. Since the focus of the I Belong group is not strictly the refugee claim, and that's what Rainbow does, they really blend well because LGBTQ plus refugee claimants meet at Rainbow, then they go to I Belong. At the I Belong group, they can meet with other LGBTQ refugees, not necessarily claimants. They expand the LGBTQ network in this community, the empowerment that comes with that. The I Belong counseling group is a trauma healing through arts and movement, addressing the neurobiology base of trauma. You know, it's stories are witnessed, honor, and contain. That's the way trauma healing happens. If you have questions or curiosity about that, feel free to contact me and ask VAST. There's also the access to community resources for LGBTQ plus newcomers that we facilitate when participants come to I Belong, and a huge advocacy piece as well. We also write letters of support for clients through I Belong, and of course we do it through VAS. I may not have mentioned that, but I guess almost anyone in the community knows that. Psycholegal documentation. So, how to refer to I Belong? Encourage refugee claimants, LGBTQ plus refugee claimants to come, to show up on the second or last Monday of the month. You don't really need to register, or you don't need to register clients, or clients do not need to register. It's better if they call us again if they need interpretation, and know that the I Belong groups happen at the Mosaic Vancouver office. Wonderful, beautiful new office. The next one. So I Belong has also a very interesting piece, empowering, and it helps refugee claimants, queer refugee claimants, build community and a sense of self-validation, and it's a participation in the community. This is a picture that we took during an event at a high school in Burnaby in the context of the National Conference for Gender and Sexual Diversity. There's another event coming up at UBC very soon, a collaboration in between Mosaic, I Belong, and VAST. So I don't know, you'll get this. I encourage you to have a look at that video. Yeah, later, because I'm aware that there may be some obstacles with sound, but it brings the spirit of the Mosaic I Belong group for LGBTQ refugees. And the core purpose of this program is to address the very specific challenges of LGBTQ refugees, a minority within a minority, and help them build community. So it's good to have a space, a group space, where LGBTQ claimants do not have to talk only about the claim. Because oftentimes clients say, yeah, I'm more than just my claim, right? And of course they are. But yeah, so the next one in time, but I can anticipate the next one. You'll be confronted with more testimonies from clients about how I Belong has supported them. And as someone that, besides supervising the VAST team and taking part in presentation and training, I work directly with clients, I can attest to how fortunate we are in this region to have a network of integrated services. And I think this presentation today speaks to that, right? So through my work at VAST and then my involvement with I Belong and my ongoing collaboration with Rainbow Refugee, I can attest to how claimants are best supported by a referral to the Wednesday group at VAST, a weekly group, and then from there we can refer them to Rainbow and I Belong if they are LGBTQ plus claimants, and help them, again, as I said at the beginning, help claimants build community from day one. In closing, I will say, when we think about trauma recovery, there are stages described. The first one is to create safety and stabilization. And a group is a great container to do that. And the ultimate goal is to the third stage, and I'm skipping the second one, and I'm doing it on purpose. But the third and ultimate goal of trauma recovery is to build reconnection to others, to self, to the environment. And that's why groups are great, because from day one, from the very early stages of work with clients trying to support our claimant clients, we can have some drops there of reconnection and community building. And community is what survivors of violence, what clients that have been faced with forced migration were first ripped off. So it's healing in action. And that's about it, or it's not about it, but probably it's about the time that I have. Yeah.
Yes.
Looking forward to your questions and more sharing.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and thank you to all of our presenters for today. So we have come to our Q&A portion of today's event, and we have received some questions so far, but please do continue to submit your questions in the question box or email your questions to events@amseth.org, and we will do our best to get to all of our questions. So the first question is really for Erin, to clarify the refugee status document. Is that what you receive once the BOC has been submitted? There was a little bit of confusion regarding when are you officially having the refugee status?
Yeah, that is the document. And I believe on the slides by Bonnie, she actually had an image of it in her slides. So it's the document that would say refugee, what are the actual term of the document? I might as well see if I can.
Claimant protection document?
Yeah, the refugee, I'm not sure if you could hear Bonnie, but the refugee claimant protection document. And it would have generally either way, it's going to have a photograph of the individual concerned. So this document is generated both by IRCC and the CBSA during their interview, or after they've accepted the forms. Both bodies would interview the claimant. If you're making an inland claim to IRCC, you would bring your own photograph, and that would be affixed to the document. If it's with CBSA, they would take your photograph there. And this document comes to the claimant in sort of a official package of materials, and that'll be one of the items they're given at the same time. And this will have the instructions for taking the immigration medical examination, the phone numbers for designated doctors that they would go to. And it'll all come following your interview, which would be the eligibility assessment by the officer.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Erin. The next question is for Bonnie. So from working with SOS, do settlement workers accompany refugee claimant clients to access other services? For example, do you go with them to Service Canada or other organizations where they need to access service, and some of these referrals that you were mentioning?
Normally we don't, because of, as you can see, that we only have a few settlement workers. But we have so many new clients that we need to help with. So normally we don't, we're not able to do that unless that there's an exceptional cases like that the refugee claimant speaks a language that it's difficult to find an interpreter to accompany the refugee claimant to the service provider office. And if our settlement worker is able to get special permission from our manager, then it probably will be an exception case that the settlement worker could escort the client to the office. But normally we don't do that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bonnie. And so, Fran, something that you mentioned during your presentation is, what is a minister's representative at a hearing?
That's a lawyer that represents CBSA, IRCC, or the Minister of Public Security. Is that what it's called? It's the government, basically, and they only attend the hearing if they are against the refugee claimant's case, and they attend in the Western region, I believe, is 30% of the hearings or less. I think it's less currently.
Okay, perfect. And Erin, you mentioned about, for specifically the work permit situation for clients from DCO countries. Could you please expand on that?
180 days.
There's a little bit of confusion about when clients from DCO countries are eligible to receive a work permit.
Well, essentially, the regulations state that all refugee claimants are entitled to a work permit once their claim has been referred to the Refugee Protection Division. But there's then a subparagraph below that says, except countries from, well, designated countries of origin, in which case they have to wait 180 days from the referral.
Okay. And it was also mentioned that refugee claimants would be receiving travel documentation. There was some clarification, there were some questions in regards to, do refugee claimants actually receive their original passport from their country of origin back from CBSA or IRCC, and when do they receive that?
First, you don't ever need your original passport again, because to travel or use it would be in some ways to, again, say, I trust my country of origin and I put myself under their care. Now, essentially, at time of landing, the document will be transferred from CBSA, who holds the document in storage, directly to the IRCC office for the landing. And so it would be physically there for the person in order to effect the landing, because IRCC has to have possession of that document. It's theoretically returned, but it really doesn't need to be, because it's now a defunct document. So as a refugee in Canada, what you're supposed to do is apply for a Canadian travel document from Passport Canada, which is under IRCC.
Can I add something here? For claimants who have a negative IRB decision,
then they will receive their passports back or their other IDs back when they're removed from Canada.
Well, thank you for adding to that clarification. Another question has come up regarding making a claim if you are already located within British Columbia. And it was mentioned that the only place to make that claim is in Vancouver. What alternatives exist if a person is located outside of the Metro Vancouver region, for example, in northern BC, and they would like to make a claim?
Well, I've sort of just looked around my colleagues sitting in the room, and our understanding is that you really are in the Vancouver region. And does anyone?
I don't know otherwise.
Yeah.
I know the hearings all happen in Vancouver.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any. I know they closed down CBSA on the island, right? Or IRCC down on the island.
Yeah.
So
There's no.
I guess if you got arrested by CBSA elsewhere in the province, they would probably process you, I assume.
yeah.
But I don't think there's an IRCC office that will take a refugee claim elsewhere.
Well, and I suspect if you were arrested by CBSA elsewhere in the province, you're
It's
still
like
likely to get
here. Yeah.
processed down in Vancouver.
And we have a very significant number of participants at the Wednesday group every week. Participants that are not residing in Vancouver or not even in the Lower Mainland, people from the island.
Yeah.
And it's ever increasing, mind you. Yeah.
Actually, this week's Ready Tour, there's one gentleman coming from Kamloops and one couple coming from Victoria.
Yeah.
And so for those refugee claimants, is there some travel assistance, or do they need to be able to fund their travel themselves to the Metro Vancouver region?
There is no fund for that travel, no. Sometimes I can help them find a place to stay for the night before, because it's a 9:15 Ready Tour. For example, the couple that's coming from Victoria is staying with us at Kingrace because we have a room under renovation that's available. It's sort of it's half destroyed, but it's habitable. But there is no funding for that, no, that I'm aware of.
When we get any emails or calls from people outside of Vancouver and Lower Mainland saying they mean to come, we try to accommodate so they come on a Wednesday and then there is ready tour on the Friday, and we strategize to get them, but there's no funding at all. It's on their own.
Okay. Thank you for that. And is there a cost for the immigration medical exam for refugee claimants?
It is free, but it's only done one time free for the refugee claim.
Okay. Thank you. And Fran, you were also talking about evidence that refugee claimants should be collecting. I believe, Erin, you were also mentioning that. So what kind of documents would the board take into consideration?
Well, the board theoretically considers everything, but we talk about what weight do they give it. So some things might be worth more than something else. So if we talk about online articles, something that comes from Wikipedia would be weighted or considered less valuable than something that came from Amnesty or perhaps the United Kingdom's country condition reports.
I would add that each case is very individual. So one claimant might need to be submitting a police report that he filed in his country. Another claimant might need to be submitting proof of membership in a political organization or a labor union or something. Another person might need to be submitting some sort of documentation about a relationship or land ownership. Every case is individual and very unique, so it's hard to know. There's no one set of documents that's used as evidence, but you can use emails, you can use text messages, you can use video. I mean, you can submit almost anything if it's relevant. It has to be translated, of course.
And if I may, knowing there's a lawyer in the room, but based on my experience working with claimants, even documenting efforts to get that evidence that hasn't yet reached them constitutes evidence on occasions.
And I mean, even adding to that, the method of arriving in Canada for certain documents is also something that's worth collecting and keeping. So if something was couriered to you, keep that actual envelope as well. Just to say, the one document type that everybody needs is proof of identity. That's a threshold issue at the Refugee Board. And if somebody cannot establish the country of where they're from, the board will not even actually proceed to consider the merits of their refugee claim because they simply don't know which country to compare them against. And so in terms of documenting the identity, again, there's a diminishing scale of weight. We talk from an officially issued passport to national identity cards to birth certificates, and below that, can you get school records that talk about where they're from, work or employment records, and
baptismal certificates, and then affidavits if you're desperate.
It's sort of it's a standard. Like you're on a sort of a long spectrum, and you start at one end, and every time you say that's not possible, you go, okay, then let's try this next thing with a little bit less objectively good, but still taken together or with multiple documents.
But a refugee claimant can find out, the board members will know what documents are available in each country because it's indicated in the national documentation packages. So if your client who's a refugee claimant says to you, in my country they won't give me a birth certificate, you can actually check that in the national documentation package unless there was a recent revolution that burned down the whole place. You can verify which countries are issuing which documents.
I think these are questions that our refugee claimant clients on a day-to-day basis, week-to-week basis. They attend the ready tour, they come back to the Basque Wednesday group with more questions, and some maybe the same, quote, the same question, and those that go to Rainbow Refugee or Drive Along ask the questions again. So all this continuum of support is so important to help them navigate the work, you guys, lawyers, and
And some of that even comes into the surplus element of a claim, which would be claims or grounds that only are established after a person is in Canada. If there was a change in country conditions, or maybe somebody converted to a different religion after leaving their country, getting letters or testimonies from other individuals in Canada can be really valuable.
Psychological reports. Those are important.
Tell us about it.
So yes, so it looks like it's very individual, but it's also very broad, and so it's really important to have that collective working together, and particularly also in conjunction with a lawyer. And so somebody else has asked, how many times can a refugee claimant appeal the decision if they've been denied?
Okay, so every refugee right now in Canada has a right of appeal. And just to be clear, if there was a ministerial intervention, or even if there was not, the minister will always also have a right of appeal. Now, if you're successful on appeal, well, let's just say the appeal board has 3 outcomes. They can uphold the decision that the refugee board made. They can overturn the decision of the refugee board and send the person back to the Refugee Protection Division for a rehearing, or they can overturn the decision of the Refugee Protection Division and replace it with their own decision. Let's say you are sent back to the refugee board, and you can then appeal the refugee board decision again to the Refugee Appeal Division. If, for example, the Refugee Appeal Division accepts your case, the minister would still have a right to challenge that decision to the Federal Court of Canada. And if the Refugee Division refused the refugee appeal, the claimant themselves would also have the right to challenge that decision to the Federal Court of Canada. Now, if the Federal Court accepts that judicial review, they can overturn the decision of the Refugee Appeal Division, which would mean the claimant would be sent back to the Refugee Appeal Division to have their appeal reheard. And once again, from there, you could go back to the federal court or get sent back to the Refugee Protection Division.
So no finite answer there for you.
Yeah.
Right? They can go back and forth.
I know that there's lots of movement of bodies in the room, like back and forth, back and forth. Yeah.
Can I mention that there are people that aren't eligible to appeal at the Refugee Appeal Division? People who entered Canada through the Safe Third Country Agreement aren't eligible for the Refugee Appeal Division. People whose cases were found to be manifestly unfounded are not eligible. People who are that class designated foreign nationals.
Yeah.
So it's a small group. It's not, I guess the Safe Third Country people are the most common group. It used to be DCOs, it no longer is, but the most common group of people who don't have access to that are the Safe Third Country people, and that's kind of a bummer for them. But someday that'll be fought, and you lawyers will change that.
I believe it's already
being fought. Yeah.
going back up.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, just a couple years ago, the DCO claimants did not have a right to appeal. That's now been overturned.
Yeah.
It's consistently in flux.
Yeah.
So the one thing that I think that question just really highlighted and illustrated is the complexity of supporting refugee claimants, and that it really takes the wider settlement and refugee community to really support refugee claimants from the time that they arrive through their hearing and even post-hearing, and really to integration here in BC. So I would like to thank everyone for taking the time and for presenting and sharing all of your knowledge with us today. I also like to thank the Immigration Policy and Integration Branch of the Workforce Development and Immigration Division of the Ministry of Jobs, Trade and Technology for coordinating today's learning event and for hosting and organizing the virtual learning exchange. We would gratefully acknowledge the financial support of the province of BC through the Ministry of Jobs, Trade and Technology for this training webinar. And also thank you for everyone who's joined us today for submitting all of your fabulous questions. Thank you to all of our presenters and to the AMSA team. If you're not receiving the weekly updates from SettlementNet, please go to our website and sign up. It's free for everyone to do so. Thank you again, and goodbye.